Okay, I believe everyone is back from the breakout rooms. So hello, good morning. Welcome to today's Alaska Business Forum. Good to see you all. I'm Betsy with the Chamber. I have a few logistics before I turn it over to our trusted MC, George Rowe. I know we are Zoom experts by now, but just as a reminder, please do mute yourself during the presentation so we can hear our presenters as clear as possible. And you can toggle between gallery view and speaker view if you'd like to see other attendees on the call or just focus on the speakers. And then just as a reminder, we do not have a Q&A box for today's session since we are in a meeting. So if you have a question, please let us know in the chat box or with the raise hand feature. And George and I will call on you live during the Q&A. If we have any folks on the phone as well, we will give you an opportunity to unmute yourselves as well during that Q&A portion. So with that, those are all of my housekeeping tips. I would like to turn it over to George Rowe to begin this forum. George, welcome.
Thank you, Betsy. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Alaska Business Forum. As Betsy noted, I'm George Rowe. I'm chair of the Alaska Business Forum, and I'm serving today as their moderator and MC. We've got some great speakers to discuss some really interesting legislation that is potentially upcoming relating to the changing climate and what this could mean for Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. As a reminder, the goal of the Alaska Business Forum is to hear the latest information and to learn impacts for Alaskan industries, stakeholders, etc., not to promote, not to endorse any particular side. We recognize climate change is a hot topic, that's a pun intended, and we appreciate everyone's respect to our speakers and during the Q&A time. Before we get started, I want to thank Alaska Airlines, who's sponsoring this series, and Scott Haberstad from Alaska Airlines is actually here with us today. We'd like to invite him to share a few thoughts before we begin the program. Welcome, Scott.
George, thank you, and good morning, Alaska Business Forum. You know, there's a lot going on in this space, and so I'm excited to hear these upcoming presentations. But just to share a little bit about us at Alaska Airlines and what we're doing, we call it creating lift in the communities we serve, and it's adding value to our employees, our guests, and the communities in which we fly to. And how do we do that? Well, we do it by flying cleaner at Alaska Airlines. We have one of the youngest fleets in the nation, which enables us to save money on fuel. And while that's both economically a positive outcome, it's also an environmentally positive outcome as well. We see it as flying greener. You'll look as you're flying on our airplanes, you'll see the real cool, what they're called split wing scimitars out at the end of the wingtips. And while they make the airplane look a lot cooler, they actually save about 15 to 20% of fuel, depending on the aircraft in which we're operating. And you'll also find us, if you've flown us prior to the pandemic, you see that we are recyclers. Our flight attendants go through the aisles and they separate plastics, metals, and paper products, because we are recycling all of that stuff on our airplanes. As we evolve out of COVID, we will go back to that routine because we find a great deal of pride in doing the right thing for the communities in which we serve. And with that, I got to leave you with a message. We have a Booking for Love sale going on right now. So if you don't want the snow in the Pacific Northwest, you can go to Palm Springs or anywhere else really quick. So with that, turn it back over to George. I wish you all a safe and happy weekend.
Thank you, Scott. We're going to begin with a little bit of level setting on this current federal legislation. Toward that end, we're being joined today by a gentleman named John Mulligan. He's from the Monument Advocacy Organization. He's a partner there. If you don't know, Monument Advocacy is it's a kind of a boutique government relations, strategic communications, and public affairs firm that specializes in managing complex public policy issues like the one we're going to talk about today. He's a Capitol Hill veteran. He's worked in the Washington State Senate, and he served as a legislative director and chief of staff to U.S. Representative Adam Smith from Washington, a Democrat. He's currently the ranking Democrat on, Adam Smith is currently the ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee. John, thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you, George, for the introduction, and happy to join you all today. As George mentioned, I worked for Adam Smith, and I'm actually a native of Washington State, so it's I'm very familiar with the Seattle Chamber and glad to speak to you. So can we go to the next slide? I only have 2 slides. That's a little overview of what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start by talking about, kind of where Biden has been on climate, in the last year and certainly in the last few months. So throughout the campaign last year, he has talked about climate change consistently through the campaign, through the election, after the election, and through the inauguration. And he sees this as a priority, not just to address climate, but also as a way to recover from the economic recession. And at a high level, I'm going to just talk a little bit about his goals, and then we'll kind of get into more of the specifics. So his plan, which really, I think, unified the Democrats and represents a Democratic consensus, is to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, to have a carbon-free power sector by 2035, really big focus on job creation. I mean, they're almost indistinguishable. I think the climate plan can also be considered a jobs plan. And he's talked a lot about how this is, at least in part, about creating, in his words, good union jobs. Environmental justice is also a huge priority, both for the administration and Democrats. And in fact, his plan has called for a federal commitment that disadvantaged communities receive 40% of the overall benefits of clean energy spending. And finally, that this is a whole of government plan. So, historically, climate has been run by, Department of Energy and EPA and so forth. Every agency is going to have a remit on climate and a role to play. And so you're already seeing that this is not, this is a broad-based government effort. Right now, I think, as everyone knows, the administration and Congress is almost 100% focused on the COVID relief package. That's occupying a ton of time. This is the bill that is centered on, vaccines and unemployment benefits and schools and state and local aid. This is under development right now. It's likely to be resolved in about a month. The working deadline for passage is March 14th. And then when that's completed, the expectation is that both the administration and Congress are going to turn to, among other things, an infrastructure and climate bill. And to get a sense for where that's going, I think it's helpful to take a look at what has happened in Congress over the last year or so. So it's been very active. This year is going to be active. It's been active on climate. For Democrats, 2020 in particular was aimed at developing policy ideas and a platform that represented a consensus view of Democrats. So the goal was to have that policy framework in place so that if they could elect a Democrat to the White House and take over the Senate, that they would be poised and ready for pretty quick action on climate. That ended up being a pretty smart strategy because that is what happened. But the execution of that vision is going to be, has to be done in the context of really narrow margins, more narrow than last Congress in the House, and obviously 50-50 in the Senate. And so I'm not going to go into great detail here, but if you want to look at what has been done, because I do think it is going to inform what will be done, I'd suggest that you look at the House Climate Crisis Committee report that came out last summer. There was a Senate Climate Committee report that also came out last summer. HR 2, which was the House Infrastructure and Climate Bill, it's called the Moving Forward Act, and then the Clean Future Act, which was put together by the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And it's too much to say that these are templates necessarily, but they all provide some insight into how Democrats are thinking about climate legislation. And they all, to varying degrees, do map to quite a lot of what Biden has been focused on. So now moving forward, Biden has obviously done quite a lot on executive orders, but he wants his climate policy to be, as he said, durable and irreversible. And that means that it's got to be done through legislation. And so that's where this infrastructure package that is expected to begin in the spring fits in. It is infrastructure and climate kind of combined. And it really does map to his goals of both addressing climate and creating jobs. We expect that on the 23rd of February, Biden, or about there, Biden will address a joint session of Congress, and expect that he will outline some of his kind of top line priorities for that package. And so when the COVID package is done, we'll turn to this and we'll get a little more insight in the coming weeks on some of his goals. So right now he's said, and congressional Democrats have said, they really do want this to be bipartisan. And so that's the goal now. We'll see how that plays. Historically, infrastructure has been quite bipartisan, but it's kind of unclear, if that goal is going to be met. And I'm going to just walk through a few things. This is not an exhaustive list at all, but a few things that have been part of last year's infrastructure package, and a lot of what is in the conversation now for climate in that package. So the first thing is tax. There has been, kind of broad bipartisan support for tax benefits for clean energy deployment and technologies. I would expect there will be something in there on that. A climate bank, or a CEDA, which is a clean energy deployment agency. This is an organization, a government-sponsored agency that would provide financial tools aimed at deploying clean energy technology and projects. I would expect quite a lot of investment in climate resilient infrastructure. So think grid modernization, deployment of electric vehicle charging stations, energy efficiency in homes and buildings, converting school buses nationwide to zero emissions. So investments and spending as well. I would expect some focus on innovation. So R&D, that's mostly through the Department of Energy, but likely some other agencies will participate in that as well. A clean energy standard is something that has been kicked around for a lot of years. And I think there's a lot of creative thinking about how you can put in place policies that would mandate a transition to zero carbon electricity generation, over a period of time. That is the idea of standards like that is very popular among Democratic lawmakers right now. Environmental justice, again, will be an enormous part of this. And then there's a lot of interest in nature-based solutions. And by that, I mean, conservation, forest management practices, using agricultural practices to sequester carbon in the soil. That's a kind of a growing area of interest, and also something that gets bipartisan support. And outside of that package, I think, in the appropriations process this year, we'll see a lot of focus on climate. And I think in the National Defense Authorization Act, annual bill authorizes DoD and their activities. As George mentioned, Adam Smith is chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. He'll play a big role in shaping that. And I would imagine that will also carry some climate-related actions as well. But again, I think the main area of focus is going to be this kind of infrastructure climate package that, we'll see kick off in the spring. And I think consideration of that will continue through the summer, and maybe a package completed by fall. So that's the quick rundown on what to expect this year. And I'm happy to take questions or just stand by until others have an opportunity to weigh in.
Thanks so much, John. First of all, before everybody else jumps in with questions, Could you just jot the names of those bills that you said we should be checking in the chat window so we can go back and have that as a record? So we do have some moments for a couple questions. If anybody wants to raise their hand, Betsy, could you just monitor that? My window tracking is a little bit poor here right now.
Since we just have a minute, just feel free to also shout out a question if you have one for John. If not, we'll move on to our other presenters.
So I like to have 1,000 questions, but I'm kind of holding my fire until. So, okay, so let's go ahead and push the questions and act toward the collective question. If you're able to stay with us, John, that'd be terrific.
No problem.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, so let's give our attention now to our next speaker, Linda Behnken. She's the Executive Director of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. Under her leadership, ALPHA, as they're known, has received recognition nationally for its role as a leader in fisherman-led advocacy, supporting coastal fisheries and the communities from which they draw and which they serve. She is a founding member also of the Alaska Sustainable Fisheries Trust and the Fishing Communities Coalition. And she is the National Policy Committee co-chair at the Marine Fish Conservation Network. So she knows wherever she speaks. Linda, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction. Let me see if I can pull up some slides here. There we go. Okay, well, as George said, I'm a director of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. I am also a commercial fisherman, and I am going to share what I know today about a piece of the climate legislation that's out there that's called 30 by 30, which for people who are not familiar with the term, refers to protecting or conserving 30% of lands and oceans by 2030. And that's my boat. Let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about where the 30 by 30 concept came from. It's been something talked about in international forums for a while. In 2016, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature set this goal, talking about marine protected areas. And then in last year, in 2020, in this country, there was a bill introduced to the House that contained the 30 by 30 goal in Title II, which called for protecting, with that term defined as excluding commercial extractive uses from 30% of the ocean. So including commercial fisheries, not recreational fisheries, but focused on real high level of protection. And that bill really triggered a big pushback from the commercial fishing industry. In the US, the industry has quite a record for sustainable fisheries, a lot of engagement with stakeholders in a science-based and public process. So really push back about the definition of protecting and action that needed to be taken to address climate change, including excluding commercial fishermen from this much of the ocean. What came out in January 27th of this year by executive order from the president had some significant changes from what was in that legislation from last year. And I'll talk about those in a minute. But before going into that, I just wanted to point out that there is really no sort of international or scientific unanimity around the 30% goal. There are differing international groups, different scientists taking a stand behind different approaches and different amounts. Just to flag one, the Conservation on Convention on Biological Diversity is called for strict protection of 10% of the world's oceans with area-based conservation management on 30%, which is their sort of right now goals. And if you look at UN definitions, 37% of US waters right now are under some form of conservation, with 23% strictly protected, which is our national monuments. So I raise this not to say that there's no more that the US needs to do to address climate change or build resilience into our system, but just to be clear that there are scientists on both sides of this conversation, and also differing goals sort of out there relative to what this 30 by 30 goal, or what building resilience and addressing climate change in the ocean space might mean. So back to the EO, it's 14008, which was titled Tackling the Climate Crisis. And it did, in speaking to ocean-based and land-based climate action, direct a science-based process to conserve land, waters, oceans, and biodiversity, is a strong commitment to social justice, which I think is consistent with what John was saying earlier, as well as protecting public health and how we go about addressing climate change. And again, consistent with what John was saying, establishing a cross-agency task force, so sort of the whole government being in on how we address climate change moving forward. The EO in section 216 does call for the Secretary of the Interior, working with others, to submit a report to this task force in 90 days, recommending steps to engage stakeholders to achieve the goal of conserving, so using not the word protect, but conserving 30% of land and waters by 2030. Also, section 216 in these two parts of that speaks to directing various agencies to solicit input to identify strategies to secure broad participation from stakeholders to achieve that goal, and that the report shall propose guidelines to determine whether lands and waters qualify for conservation. So naming in particular state, local, tribe, or territorial officials, agriculture, forest, fishermen are in there, just all the key stakeholders that I think the public brought forward as being really important to include in this conversation. And then finally in 216C, directs the Secretary of Commerce through NOAA to initiate efforts within 60 days to solicit input from stakeholders on how to make fisheries and protected resources more resilient to climate change, and doing that through these changes in management, improvements in science, monitoring, cooperative research. So quite a difference from the language that was in the legislation that was introduced last year, and to our mind, quite responsive to some of the sort of unified stakeholder comment on recognizing that sustainable fisheries really are a big part of meeting some of the climate goals. So some of the key issues, though, remaining from what came out in the EO is, what is the definition of conserve? What does it mean to sort of qualify for conservation? Who gets to decide what that definition is and what areas qualify for that additional conservation? What is the process to securing that stakeholder input? And then finally, to all of us who have been involved for a while in the ocean and fisheries management space, are we reinventing the wheel? So this is probably a review for many of you, but in oceans, there is a process, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Management Act, which was passed in 1976. It's been regularly reauthorized. In fact, we are right now in the process of reauthorization. But it's a science-based public process to conserve fisheries and marine resources that relies on the local knowledge of stakeholders through these 8 regional fishery management councils. And in fact, those councils have done it quite a bit to take care of habitat that's under their jurisdiction, whether it's been for a specific species or to protect that habitat from specific impacts. So it's the West Coast and Alaska, and you can see it's quite a patchwork of conservation areas that are closed to certain uses or certain fishing gears. I'm from Sitka, which is in Southeast Alaska. You can see the yellow block that's to the right-hand side of your screen. That area was closed to trawling to protect sensitive habitat, but primarily to provide for the small boat fisheries that are characteristic of the Southeast communities and really rely on fishing in those areas. So nationwide, there's also been a lot done, not just on the West Coast in Alaska, but by these regional councils to protect habitat. This is just looking at the areas that are close to bottom trawling, which is a relatively high impact fishing gear. And you can see there's varying levels of protections that have been put in place. But in overall, 76% of these areas are closed to bottom trawling. They're open to other kinds of fishing, but that gear type is not allowed or prohibited in those areas within US waters. In the 1996 reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, councils were directed to identify essential fish habitat for all the fisheries under their respective jurisdiction, with essential fish habitat defined as those areas essential for the spawning, rearing, feeding, and basically the full life cycle of those fisheries. And with input from the scientists and stakeholders, the councils took appropriate action to conserve and to protect that habitat in varying ways. It's been a very inclusive process, a very science-informed process. This is a sketch of what that process looks like, which leads to this, somewhat complicated slide, but just a envisioning of what this 30 by 30 process could look like, with a very top-down approach on the left and a much more bottom-up or inclusive approach on the right. So on the left, thinking about, maybe we have this 30% target. We're not quite all in agreement about whether that's the right amount or not. And that there would be, different areas nominated. You'd probably have some groups supporting those areas, some opposing, fair bit of sort of conflict and pushback, and maybe eventually designations and some implementation, versus a process on the right where there's a lot more conversation around what are we trying to protect, what are those areas vulnerable to, what processes might be important, necessary to put in place, what could happen in those areas without compromising the goals of conserving that area, and what may not be compatible with those uses that should be excluded. And throughout that process, a real reliance on input from stakeholders, from tribe, science, fishery. So all the people who are involved in relying on these resources and also benefiting from the ocean resources. So just in summary, we really recognize, I think, those of us who are on the water, particularly in Alaska, that climate change is taking a significant toll on our state, on our fisheries, on our oceans. Those impacts are complex. They demand rapid but a carefully crafted response. To be durable, the response needs to be informed by science and developed with meaningful stakeholder engagement, including the engagement of Indigenous, tribal, and other rural residents. So sort of reflecting back on the social justice commitments of this administration. We believe the council system will need to expand to more fully incorporate that input and take on that challenge. But for fisheries and oceans, it provides a clear forum to help answer some of the key questions about what needs to be conserved, what are we conserving it from, who is included in that decision making, and how to get to outcomes with the kind of support needed to make them durable. So I'd stop there. I'd be happy to answer questions now, or let others speak, and then circle back to answer questions at the end.
Thanks, Linda. I think we will put the questions at the end of the time, but let me just encourage people that if you do have questions for any of the speakers, although we would like to provide you the opportunity to voice those, In case we run out of time, this is an important topic. I want to make sure that we capture people's ideas and interests. So make sure that if you can, that you just jot them in the to everyone portion of the chat. And then our speakers can be thinking about your questions and interests as well as reacting in real time. So we will now move to our next speaker, Brent Greenfield. Brent is the ex-executive director of the National Ocean Policy Coalition. Got many years of experience in the energy sector, regulatory policy, the federal executive branch, and national political campaigns. And these include positions with HBW Resources Limited Liability Corporation, the Office of Federal Communications Commission Chairman Kevin Martin, the White House Office of Counsel to the President, and the Bush for President 2000 campaign. Brent, we're looking forward to your remarks. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, George. And it's great to be here with you all today, virtually, and hopefully someday, not too long from now, we can have an opportunity to engage in person. I want to start first by thanking Betsy, George, and the team at the Seattle Chamber and Alaska Airlines for sponsoring this event, for the opportunity to speak with you all today. My focus is going to be on federal climate policy developments, specifically as they pertain to the marine space, and how they might affect interests in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. But before delving into the latest on the policy scene, I just want to give you all some brief background on the coalition. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll give you some of that background here. The coalition was established in 2010 to provide a voice for commercial and recreational interests in the development and implementation of federal ocean policy. We saw that NGOs and academia were being represented, but there was not a unified voice and forum from the commercial and recreational user group community. Our membership and allies represent commercial and recreational interests across the maritime economy, including fishing, energy, marine transportation, and seafood processors, to name a few. Our members and allies also include additional groups and sectors, including inland interests related to agriculture and timber, among others. As you'll see from some of the sampling of members and allies on this slide, we have strong participation from groups in the Alaska Pacific Northwest region. And interests in this region have been instrumental in efforts to support sound decision-making in Washington. In sum, our goal is to support greater understanding of our nation's ocean and coastal resources and the benefits they can provide in order to facilitate well-informed decision-making that's grounded in sound science and research, and to ensure that we maximize the economic and job opportunities associated with the blue economy, while at the same time conserving our resources and marine habitat for current and future generations. So if we go to the next slide, this intersection between climate and ocean that we have seen here in recent years, increasingly becoming intertwined, has been underscored by one of President Biden's top advisors, former Secretary of State and now Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, who in an address in late January reiterated comments he's made in recent years that you cannot protect the oceans without solving climate change, and you can't solve climate change without protecting the oceans. And so if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about the fact that right out of the gate, there has been a flurry of executive actions related to climate that touch on the oceans, beginning with the executive order that was issued on Inauguration Day, as well as the order on 30 by 30 that we'll talk more about in a moment. But the first one on Inauguration Day did several things. First, it directs federal entities to immediately review and take action where necessary of all federal actions taken in the last 4 years that conflict with some enumerated national objectives. And some of those objectives include bolstering resilience to climate change, restoring and expanding national treasures and monuments. And the order directs federal agencies to immediately begin work to confront the climate crisis, as the language states. It also reinstates a December 2016 presidential moratorium and executive order that does a couple of things. One, it indefinitely withdraws the entire Chukchi Sea, nearly the entire Beaufort Sea, and a little over 43,000 square miles off Alaska from any new oil and natural gas lease sales. It also reinstates the 112,000 square mile northern Bering Sea climate resilience area. Also on Inauguration Day, the acting Interior Secretary issued an order that suspends delegated authorities from taking a range of actions for 60 days. That includes the issuance of any offshore fossil fuel authorization, the publication of any Federal Register notices, or the granting of any rights of way, easements, or conveyances of property or interest in property. The order authorizes specifically identified positions within Interior Department leadership to carry out any of the actions temporarily barred from being taken under delegated authority. And it clarifies that the ban on offshore fossil fuel authorizations does not limit existing operations under valid leases. In addition, in announcing the suspension, the order cites a need to implement what it calls a targeted and time-limited elevation of relevant decisions at Interior to review questions of fact, law, and policy. The directive also states that the order ensures that the department continues its existing operations consistent with its legal obligations and policy goals. A related fact sheet that was put out the day that the order was released clarifies that in addition to not impacting existing operations under valid leases, the order does not preclude the issuance of leases, permits, and other authorizations by those specified within leadership. Now, as to how the secretarial order is being implemented, it is important to note that the new ranking member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, John Barrasso, who replaces Lisa Murkowski as the most senior Republican on that committee, has been corresponding with the acting Interior Secretary regarding reports that permits for existing leases in some places, such as Wyoming, are not being issued by the department, while permitting is proceeding in other places. Similarly, Interior is proceeding with an onshore lease sale in Nevada, but apparently does not have plans for a lease sale that was scheduled shortly after in Wyoming. Now, this has implications for the Alaska region because, as you'll see on this slide from the headline, a lease sale scheduled for this year in Alaska's Cook Inlet may now be in question, given the announcement last week that a comment period and virtual meetings related to the lease sale have been canceled. Now, moving on to the second executive order from January 27th, as was mentioned previously, it establishes a national climate task force from representatives across the government, which is tasked with supporting the organization and deployment of a government-wide approach to combat the climate crisis, including by facilitating planning and implementation of key actions, including ocean, water, land, and biodiversity conservation. The executive order also says that it will be a priority of the United States to advocate for enhanced climate ambition and integration of climate considerations through a variety of international fora that address areas including the ocean, shipping, the Arctic, and sustainable development. The executive order also directs the Interior Secretary to review siting and permitting processes to identify measures that can be taken to double offshore wind production by 2030, while ensuring protection for waters and biodiversity. It also orders the Interior Secretary to pause new oil and natural gas leasing in federal waters to the extent consistent with existing law, pending completion of a comprehensive review and reconsideration of federal permitting and leasing practices, including potential climate and other impacts. As to the oil and gas leasing review, the Secretary is directed to consider whether to adjust royalty rates or take other action to account for corresponding climate costs. Regarding the pause on new oil and gas leasing, similar to the language in the secretarial order, the fact sheet says that the targeted pause does not impact existing operations or permits for valid existing leases, which it says are continuing to be reviewed and approved. And goes on to state that the pause will provide an opportunity to review the federal leasing program to ensure that it serves the public interest. If we go to the next slide, we've heard some today from the previous speakers about the 30 by 30 initiative, as explained by them so well. This has been a global initiative that has seen significant momentum. 51 governments around the world a few weeks ago announced that they were supporting efforts to secure a global agreement at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity being held in China later this year. It's also something where we've seen state action here at home, with the governor of California issuing an executive order in October that commits his state to a goal of conserving at least 30% of its land in coastal waters by 2030. With the ushering in of a new administration in Washington, we now see that effort taking hold at the federal level as well, as underscored by the recent executive order that includes the 30 by 30 conservation goal and related actions that Linda mentioned that require engagement with stakeholders, including but not limited to fishermen. While the administration has acknowledged that about 23% of the ocean is currently strongly protected, the Interior Department also noted that the vast majority of ocean protections are found in the Western Pacific Ocean, and some outside of government have said that U.S. ocean protection is overweighted to that region. The 30 by 30 goal, which was part of the president's campaign platform, was a key part of a multi-group letter effort that the National Ocean Policy Coalition led in advance of Inauguration Day to engage President Biden and his team to let them know how important it is to support collaborative, transparent, and balanced multi-use ocean policies within existing statutory frameworks that support economic and environmental goals and remove barriers to beneficial coordination. In that letter, 70 groups from across the country and economy urged the president to take into account the conservation benefits provided under existing federal and state laws and initiatives, and to establish tools for effective engagement with the private sector, including through establishment of an advisory group that includes representation of the full range of potentially impacted industries that can serve as a platform to provide advice on and inform such an effort or any other ocean protection initiative that is not already inclusive of opportunities for robust industry consultation. In that letter, it noted that the 30 by 30 proposal has raised some concerns about the potential for impacts on a variety of sectors, and that this mechanism would help ensure decisions based on sound science and that are carefully considered and balanced. If we go to the next slide, as one might expect, there has been quite a bit of reaction on Capitol Hill, both in opposition to and in support of the new administration's actions on ocean-related climate decisions so far. The Alaska delegation, among others, has been quite active with registering their opposition to some of these actions, including through a series of bills that have been introduced to reverse the energy-specific actions, and with Congressman Young of Alaska introducing legislation that would prevent the designation of any new national marine sanctuaries off Alaska in the absence of congressional authorization, as well as require congressional and state approval for the designation of new marine monuments and congressional approval for any restrictions on public use of any designated monuments. Also of interest to those in this audience, Congressman Young has introduced bipartisan legislation this year that would prohibit the Secretaries of the Interior and Commerce from authorizing commercial finfish aquaculture operations in federal waters unless authorized by law, in addition to a bill that would reauthorize and amend the Magnuson-Stevens Act. On the other hand, there have also been a flurry of bills introduced that would support the administration's efforts, including by making permanent restrictions on access to the Arctic for energy leasing, as well as efforts to permanently ban oil and natural gas leasing off the West Coast. Although there are plenty of areas of division, there are also areas where we clearly see bipartisan agreement. As one example, Senators Murkowski and Whitehouse have recently introduced a bill known as the Blue Globe Act that, among other things, seeks to support data collection and accessibility, accelerate technology innovation, including through a new Ocean Innovation Prize, support maritime workforce development, increase understanding of the blue economy. It would task the National Academy of Sciences with assessing the potential for, it would address illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing through technology. It would also reauthorize NOAA nautical mapping and charting and survey activities. If we go on to the next slide, I've also outlined a few other areas where we see potential for federal action, both in Congress and the executive branch. One is the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Initiative, which includes an element that would support efforts to map Alaska's coast by 2030, and more broadly, to fully map the deep waters of the entire United States exclusive economic zone by 2030, and all US coastal waters by 2040. This is incredibly important work. It began under the last administration with this initiative, and we anticipate that it will continue under the new one, and it directly relates to climate in many ways, including one being that the results of this effort will provide critical data on areas that were previously inaccessible and are now opening up to access. In other areas, partnerships and coordination. The National Defense Authorization Act that became law on January 1st included several elements that are relevant to partnerships and coordination in the marine space. First, it codifies the Ocean Policy Committee, which was created in 2018 by executive order, tasking the committee with continuing its activities as it existed prior to the new law taking effect, including by engaging and collaborating with stakeholders, facilitating interagency coordination and integration, and also prescribing policies and procedures to implement the National Oceanographic Partnership Program. Now, as to the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, this law also reauthorizes the program, and it charges it with promoting national security, economic development, environmental stewardship, and strengthens science, education, and communication through improved ocean knowledge. And it also tasks it with coordinating and strengthening oceanographic efforts in support of those goals through partnerships with government, academia, and industry, among others. The bill also reauthorizes the Ocean Research Advisory Panel through 2040, requiring that the panel meet at least twice annually, and tasking NOAA with providing the panel with any necessary support. This panel includes members from industry, government, and academia, among others, and it is tasked with advising the Ocean Policy Committee on areas including implementation of the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, needs for the nation's oceanographic program, national ocean research activities, and improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in the ocean sciences and related fields. Another area where we see potential movement on the partnership front is regional ocean partnerships, such as the West Coast Ocean Alliance, that were established by states and include federal agency and others as a forum for discussing and addressing ocean issues across the respective regions. There have been recent efforts in Congress to formally authorize and provide funding to these organizations, and we expect that those efforts could continue and will continue and could result in passage. And we also expect continued support for these groups by the executive branch, as underscored by references to the regional ocean councils and stakeholder outreach in the January 27th executive order. As discussed, data and research and technology, including through the Blue Globe Act, are areas where we see more potential areas for movement. A couple of others that aren't on here, but that we see as ripe for potential action include marine debris, where Senator Sullivan in Alaska has been very actively engaged in passing the Save Our Seas Act and the Save Our Seas Act 2.0 to address marine debris, bipartisan legislation that was signed into law. That could be another area of continued focus, as well as ocean acidification. And then on the aquaculture front, there have been efforts in Congress and the executive branch to further develop a domestic aquaculture industry, including through projects in federal waters. And we expect that those discussions and efforts will continue. Whether legislation will be achieved is unclear, but we do anticipate that executive branch efforts to identify aquaculture opportunity areas will continue, with Southern California and the Gulf of Mexico serving as the initial focal points. And then just on the next slide, to close things out as to priorities for 2021, it's clear that climate is a major national priority that is being addressed by departments and agencies across the federal government. Ensuring that decisions are grounded in science and carefully considered is going to require the engagement of industries across the economy, as well as the government's allocation of the resources necessary to support sound decision-making. Additionally, we must build and continue momentum on the areas in which there is agreement, including the collection and analysis of data to support good policy, and the partnerships and actions outside of regulation, including, for example, groundbreaking research that has shown how seaweed consumption can help significantly reduce livestock emissions. So there are lots of opportunities, and together we believe that we can achieve our goal of maximizing opportunities associated with the blue economy in a way that will benefit both our economy and climate. Look forward to your questions, and if you ever want to reach out and have further discussion on these activities, included on the next slide my contact information, and would welcome the opportunity to discuss those with you.
Thank you very much, Brent. We're going to open it up to audience questions, but I'd like to ask John, Linda, and Brent to please, if you're willing for people to contact you individually after this discussion, rather than relying on the slides to share your contact data, please just put your email in the chat. And we understand you're bombarded with all kinds of stuff every day, so it's totally no worries if that just won't work. But that might be an opportunity if we run out of time here for people to get in touch with you. I know I would appreciate that. So we don't have a formal Q&A box. Instead, we've got the chat. And also, if you click on your image in the participants, you can see that you can raise your hand. So I did see in the chat that Chris Barrows had a question that he wanted to ask with a little kind of preamble. Chris, would you like to unmute yourself and turn on your camera and ask your question?
There we go. Thanks, George, and I appreciate all the panelists. It was I learned a lot, and I guess in the content, my question relates to this IUCN group. I know a little bit about them, but particularly Linda spoke to the basis behind that and the global momentum associated with the concept that is being memorialized in a national objective for 30 by 30. And I just want to understand a little bit more the basis behind that from a scientific standpoint and what IUCN brings to the validity and the objective behind that. And I did want to highlight too, because not all of us are a lot of us are ocean related, but I think that there's some terrestrial, I understand there's terrestrial component to this in the legislation and in the concept in terms of how it's being applied in the United States. So I didn't want to, for those other Alaska businesses that have a more terrestrial focus, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to comment on that either. But I'd appreciate the panelist perspective on the basis behind that standard. Thank you.
Sure, maybe I can start and then let Brent add to what I say, but a little bit on the IUCN. It was formed in 1948, so it's been around for a while. It has membership from states, governments, NGOs, tribes. They see themselves as being sort of a global authority on the natural world and in identifying measures to safeguard that natural world. There's over 1,400 members in the IUCN, and I think it was 1998 they gained observer status at the UN. So a fairly significant presence, I think, in the international stage. As far as the science behind the 30 by 30, I think there have been various scientists along the ecologists, scientists, through history who have said certain percentage of the world should be set aside to not have human impact or to not have any level of extraction. There's quite a body of science, including a letter that was sent to Congress after the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act was introduced in the House, claiming that the role of marine protected areas is significant in countries where there's been a lot of overfishing or a lot of habitat damage, but in a country such as the US, where there's already a lot of measures in place to conserve or manage fisheries, where we have sustainable fisheries as a sort of golden rule of how we manage with requirements to rebuild stocks that are overfished, that MPAs don't play a role, shouldn't play a role, and are not necessary. So I would just say there is science on both sides. It's still an active discussion. There's nothing magic about 30%. I think that's why I included that you sort of notice that the Union for Biological Diversity has said, conserve 30%, strictly protect, which would be more your MPA approach of 10%. Find those areas that are biologically diverse, focus on 60% of those, conserve 30, strictly protect 10. So there's a lot of numbers out there. And I think a lot of science, and I would just hope we don't get wound up in sort of quibbling over numbers. That to me, that should not be the goal. The goal should be looking where there might be additional benefits to the resource or to building resilience into our fisheries and to integrating between land and water in ways that that do do build a robustness into our natural resources. And I would just, note, George, you had mentioned about essential fish habitat. I think that's a perfect place where we can build that kind of integration between land and water. Is when you think about salmon, they spend a big part of their life out at sea, but also they're extremely vulnerable to what happens on land and in rivers and streams. And unless there's integration of measures to conserve that habitat, you can do all you want in the ocean and you're not going to keep salmon healthy. So I hope there's an integrated approach with a lot of input from stakeholders, as well as scientists, and a focus more on durable climate solutions rather than numbers. And should we start with 30? Should we start with 20, 10? To me, that's not as relevant.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, and completely agree that the more we focus on the goal in terms of resilient oceans and the sustainability that we all want to see, and less into the numbers game, I think the more successful of an outcome we're going to achieve, ensuring that it is science-based and that it is objective driven, and that there's a lot going on already. I mean, some of those activities have been covered by Linda through some of the efforts of the fishery management councils. Some of them have taken place outside of the regulatory context with some exciting partnerships between the private sector and government, and some just taken on by the private sector on its own. And then within the regulatory sphere, I mean, there are examples where we see, in addition to the Fishery Management Council process, that have been very successful. And one example of that is the flower garden banks in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a thriving area off the coast of Texas, out on the western Gulf of Mexico, teeming with coral reefs. It's a destination for divers. And it's also in the area where there is a lot of other activities that are taking place as well. It's really what we think is a showcase example of successful multi-use ocean policy. And there was a very extensive process that was used to re-examine those boundaries and to come up with a modified expansion that added some additional areas to the flower garden banks. It was actually just finalized in the last few weeks. And by bringing all of these groups together that Linda mentioned, they were able to, and using an advisory council to do that, they were able to come up with a consensus solution that, again, it's getting to the overall goals that we all have, without starting with a percentage goal. Just looking at the area, what is the science? What can we do to have added benefits from a sustainability standpoint and a conservation standpoint? So we think there are some very good models out there that we can build on as we move forward and looking at conservation in the future.
Terrific. I don't see questions other than my own in the chat, and I haven't seen any hands raised.
George, we did have one from Rich Berkowitz.
Great, Rich.
Hi, George and Brent. Nice to meet you, Linda. I have, you answered, I started the question, then you kind of answered much of it, Brent. So maybe Linda would have some additions to add to what you had touched upon with respect to the Blue Water Act and Save Our Seas. It's always an interest, I think, in folks from this forum and previous committee, Alaska Committee of the Chamber, to see our delegations working together with Alaska's delegation. So to that end, are there other issues, or in your druthers, what would be a likely and possible outcome of such collaboration going forward in the Biden administration? Anything that really you would have great interest in seeing them collaborate on? Linda first.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think certainly our delegations will work together in ensuring there's a science-based public process for addressing this 30 by 30 executive order, but I also see a lot of room for collaboration. I think in speaking to what some of the policy, I think it was John was talking about how there'll be all the probably tax breaks and all kinds of incentives to improve energy efficiency in buses and in cars and in everything on land. And there is so much room and a whole lot of interest in improving the same kind of fuel efficiency or reducing the carbon footprint of the fishing fleet, and very little out there right now to support going that direction, converting where we can to hybrid, maybe moving towards hydrogen based fuels to lower our carbon footprint. So I think that's a place where all of our delegations in the Biden administration can come together. So again, finding those places where it's a win-win for the industry, for the environment, and incentivizing that kind of transition by changing the structure of taxes or looking at ways to provide grant funding support for innovation in that way. And I think the issues that, for example, Senator Sullivan have tackled with plastics in the ocean, there's lots more that needs to be done there to address point source impacts of that. We know now a lot of where those plastics are and where they're going, but really putting the stops on more going into the ocean and doing something to deal with what's in the ocean, its impact on our fisheries and marine environment are important next steps. And I think there's lots of room for collaboration there.
Thank you. I have kind of a follow-up for you as well, Linda, but Brent, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree. I think plastics, marine plastics is going to be an area of continued focus. And then I think just going back to technology, innovation, data and partnerships, I think those are going to be areas where you're going to see support across the aisle and certainly from the administration to move forward. And on the technology and innovation front, I mean, you're looking at everything from opportunities with blue carbon. Seaweed, as I mentioned, is one example of how the ocean can be a solution when it comes to climate, and of course, energy and opportunities there, just to name a few.
Thank you. Linda, you brought up the potential for hydrogen for propulsion systems for vessels. One, both Crowley and Toad were the first ones out the gate on LNG and converting their vessels to have that as a source for propulsion. Matson has also built vessels with that, and that certainly, arguably could be kind of bridge technology for hydrogen, and it certainly is that technology could also be used for renewable LNG, bio LNG. But there's a lot of folks in the environmental community that are just like, insist, no, LNG is part of greenhouse gases, and literally have even said to me, better to have open loop scrubbers systems than LNG, which I find, really incredibly short-sighted. Even if it was a closed loop system, that would end up going over the side for a lot of vessel operators, particularly those outside our borders and a hemisphere. So, any comments about that as kind of a bridge fuel and into hydrogen and other renewables?
I think it's an area where there's a lot of room for innovation, and there certainly is going to need to be a transition period as we work towards zero carbon emissions in our fleet. I know, for example, Sitka is it's hydro powered. We have an abundance of rain around here. And so what we're looking at is, as a first step, is hybrid engines that, revert back to diesel on a trip that's too long for your batteries to do the complete power system that you need, but use when we're operating at low power, which is where we usually are, low RPMs for trolling, long lining, almost everything we do when we're fishing other than charging in and out. You could use that, the basically rain power, through a battery bank on the boat while we continue to explore what those next steps might be. And it may be different in different regions, what makes the most sense as in that transition period. and maybe ultimately what's the best fuel for that place. We're focused on the hybrid electric diesel right now because of having hydropower and sort of an abundance of hydropower in Southeast Alaska.
This is
Thank
George.
you.
I'm going to just jump in because we have another question coming in. But I think that idea of maritime electrification is a really interesting one, and the bridge energy pathways forward. I'll just point out that there was a recent report that did energy audits on a whole range of Alaska vessels, so short and long, in terms of energy requirements. And so that's a really useful resource that folks like Washington Maritime Blue, the Alaska Ocean Cluster, et cetera, these are pathways that if we can just start small and build these collaborations and interactions between our states, it will build. And so I think there's some really exciting opportunities here. Peter, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. Thanks very much. I just wanted to share with folks a very exciting new program underway, which is our Maritime Innovation Center. You may have heard about it at Fisherman's Terminal. We're working to retrofit and repurpose the old Fisherman's supply, one of the oldest buildings in the port's portfolio. I think it's where the port originally had its offices around 1914. At any rate, this program is co-sponsored by Governor Inslee and the state of Washington. We're expected to open the Maritime Innovation Center in 2023, beautifully designed work by Miller Hull, but it will be an opportunity for trying to take on some of these major issues about transitioning to a green maritime or blue maritime, if you will, and startups that are doing innovative work. We already have a number of them on board, and we have a number of partner organizations. I think it's close to 100 now. So very exciting. You can go to the port's website, Port of Seattle, and I'm port commissioner at, if you don't know me there. And I'm particularly thrilled about this project. It's hopefully it will help support all the challenges ahead with what has been discussed here today by Linda and others regarding our transition to a maritime blue economy, if you will, and innovation that's possible there. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you. Great forum.
Hey, Peter, this is George. I just sent a message to you in the chat. I know that there's good work happening while we're doing the MIC preparations, et cetera. If people are interested in talking to someone at Washington Maritime Blue, whether it's an innovation or other aspects, would they just go to the website and access like the contact us there, or contact you, or what do you think? We can't hear you.
Hang on. Sorry. So I think the administrator muted me again. You can always contact our office, Port of Seattle Commission office, me, anyone. I'll be happy to help. I'm not sure who the key contacts are with regard to the program aspects of this project, but I can certainly find out and pass along that information.
But I think Joshua Berger is one.
Joshua Berger,
yeah,
absolutely, at the state. He's the lead on behalf of Governor Inslee. So I hope everybody will look into this, and hopefully we'll find some great new opportunities in the future to partner.
Betsy, do we have any other hands raised that I can't see, or should I ask one away?
Nope, I think we can transition to a few questions from you, George.
Great. So I always like to find things that are happening already so that you don't have to spin up the wheel and get it going, and then kind of leverage that. So we're going to see a lot of emphasis on sustainable energy solutions. Some of those will be offshore, some of them will be onshore, but water accessed. And so what I'm wondering is, as you look at these synergies, at these challenges for like assessing where should we start? What are the impacts to different species, the overall integrated ecosystem, which isn't just water, there's air and land and all that stuff. How can the investment in, let's just say, maritime related energy how can that be synergistic or symbiotic with some of the issues that we've talked about today?
I think one, thanks George for the question, is it's sort of naturally occurring, and it's happening in the absence of, regulation and mandates. And I think we've seen it especially through things like, ESG and sustainability programs that companies here and around the world more and more are adopting and applying as their way of doing business. One, because in many cases they just want to. In addition, they're being told by their investors that this is where they need to go, and that it's an expectation, part of a social license to operate. And so I think we're seeing a lot of this happening kind of in a natural way, which I think gets back to, we talk about the 30 by 30, making sure that initiatives that are already happening, be they through regulation or otherwise, are being accounted for, and that we highlight those that are doing it well as successes and try to build on them through that way. But I'll stop there, and Linda, if you have anything you want to add to that.
I think that's a great answer, and I would just echo that it's recognizing where we have measures in place that are promoting sustainability and promoting innovation within maritime, whether it's fishing or other maritime trades, and making sure that new mandates coming down don't impede that, but in fact build on those efforts. I did, if I could, wanted to circle back to a question you had put in the, George, in the chat earlier about essential fish habitat, because I think it ties in really well right here. You had asked about how that's defined and how all those stages, say for salmon, might be covered. And I think that's sort of a key place where the federal government, NOAA right now, which is responsible for fisheries, has no jurisdiction over what does happen in streams or a way to take care of fish during that part of their life cycle. But right now, with this reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, sort of speaking of what's already in place and what ongoing efforts are out there, there is proposed language to strengthen NOAA's role through a consultative process in saying, let's make sure what we're doing, upstream with these fish stocks is not compromising the health of that resource. So that's the Magnuson-Stevens Act is a act that's been in place since '76. It's an act that's really worked to conserve these fishery resources. Let's use that process to build on that success to make sure we are making salmon more resilient to climate change, and using those existing practices and not sort of decoupling that as we start to move maybe towards the 30 by 30 conversation. So yeah, I think it's really being clear about what's happening, building on those successes, and making sure we're not precluding or sort of making it harder for the innovation that's already happening and the conservation already in place to be successful.
And George, I see you had a question in the chat about the mapping initiative that I mentioned. So yes, this is an interagency effort. It was launched in November 2019 through a presidential memorandum. And the mapping part of the initiative is being led by NOAA. And it is designed to better understand more about the physical and biological nature of our resources, and to make sure that our ocean and coastal areas are fully mapped with a couple of the deadlines that I mentioned, the Alaska coast by 2030 and all the deep waters and all US coastal waters by 2040. We do anticipate that is going to continue with the current administration, and there is an effort as part of that memorandum with regard to streamlining permitting to make sure that the permits needed to conduct such mapping and exploration activities are being processed in as efficient a manner as possible. We expect that will continue as well. The particulars, depending on how that all shapes up, remain to be seen. But we certainly don't see anything stopping down the mapping part of it and the efficient permitting to a certain degree.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I think there's this really high-tech, fancy way of virtual clapping, but if I don't master that, I just want to thank all of you for the speakers for sharing your thoughts with us and all the participation from our attendees. I think we'll go ahead and wrap this part of our conversation right now. Thank you to both of you for sharing your contact data. John had to leave because of another commitment, but Betsy did paste his contact data in the chat if any of you are interested in reaching him. So Betsy, may I hand you the talking stick, if you will, and take it from here?
Please. And I see some of us mastered that virtual clapping. So just once again, want to thank, of course, our speakers, Brent, Linda, and John, and our trusty MC, George, for leading us through today's discussion. Really appreciate it. And also want to thank Alaska Airlines for sponsoring today's program. So as you know, we have another program coming up next month in just 3 weeks. It's going to be on Friday, March 5th on emerging trends in the Arctic. We are going to be joined by Rachel Callender, who's the founder and executive director of Arctic Encounter, as well as John Reeves, who is the former commanding officer of the icebreaker Healy. So kind of the past and present, future of the Arctic. It's going to be a really interesting discussion, so hope you can join us for that. And of course, I will add a link for that in our thank you email that will go out later today, along with the recording of today's session. So thank you so much for joining us. If you're in Seattle, be careful of the snow this weekend, and for everyone else, enjoy your weekend, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.